afternoon. On the early afternoon of January 7th, 1969, the body of Jane Britton, who was then 23 years old, originally from Needham, a graduate student in anthropology at Harvard University, was found in her Cambridge apartment. It was determined that Ms. Britton had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. For the past 50 years, the murder of Jane Britton has intrigued members of the public and has posed a number of investigatory challenges for law enforcement. Multiple teams of investigators have looked into tips from the public, followed up on all available leads, and ruled out multiple suspects. As a direct result of their perseverance and the utilization of the latest advances in forensic technology by the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, I am today confident that we are able to say that the mystery of who killed Jane Britton has finally been solved. This is the oldest case that the Middlesex District Attorney's Office has been able to bring to a resolution. This year, as a result of numerous forensic tests on DNA samples collected, both those collected at the time of Jane's murder and those collected more recently, we were able to positively identify Michael Sumpter as the person responsible for Jane's murder. What we know is that on the night of January 6, 1969, Jane went to dinner with some of her Harvard classmates at the Acropolis restaurant in Cambridge. She then stopped at home to change clothes before going ice skating with her then boyfriend on Cambridge Common. After ice skating, they went to Charlie's Pub, located very close to Jane's apartment, had a beer before returning to Jane's apartment around 10:30 that evening. Boyfriend stayed at Jane's house for about an hour or so. He then left. Jane went across the hall to visit with her neighbors. She had a glass of sherry with them and collected her cat that they had been minding for her. The next morning, Jane did not appear for a very important exam she was scheduled to take. When she did not appear, her boyfriend, who was in the same exam class, having tried to reach her by telephone, at approximately 12:40 in the afternoon, went back to the apartment looking for her. When he couldn't gain access to the apartment, he talked to the neighbors, the couple she had visited with the night before. They ultimately entered the apartment and found her having been murdered in her bed. The medical examiner ruled that she had been struck by a blunt object multiple times in the head. She'd been sexually assaulted, and subsequent toxicology testing showed that her blood alcohol was negative, but that her stomach contents contained 0.08 in alcohol. That indicated that the alcohol she had ingested both at Charlie's and at the neighbors had not yet metabolized and entered her bloodstream, indicating that she was killed sometime relatively shortly after she went back to her apartment. Police learned at the time that a resident of that building had heard someone on the fire escape, which you're able to see in this photograph to the left, that connected to Jane Britton's fourth-floor apartment. A second witness detailed that a man who appeared to be approximately 6 foot tall and 170 pounds was seen running in the street near Jane Britton's apartment at approximately 1:30 on the morning of January 7th. In 1972, when Mr. Sumpter was arrested and booked for another offense, he was 5'11" and weighed 185 pounds. We now feel confident that the man identified as Michael Sumpter entered Jane's apartment through the window, assaulted her, murdered her in her bed, and then fled the apartment. We have learned through investigation that Sumpter had ties to Cambridge, including having lived in Cambridge as a young child, having attended first grade at the Cambridge Public School, having been involved with the Cambridge Police as a juvenile, and in the late 1960s, having a girlfriend who lived in Cambridge. In 1967, less than 2 years before Jane's murder, we have been able to place Sumpter working at an establishment on Arrow Street, less than a mile from Jane's apartment. And Mr. Sumpter was also arrested and convicted of a physical assault on a woman which took place in Boston, but he had met the woman at the Harvard Square MBTA station, just blocks from Jane's apartment several years later. This is the third homicide which has been linked to Michael Sumpter since the time of his death. In 2010, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office was informed that Mr. Sumpter's DNA was a match to DNA taken from the 1972 rape and murder of 23-year-old Ellen Rutchick in her Beacon Street apartment. And in 2012, a second CODIS hit matched Mr. Sumpter to evidence taken from the 1973 rape and murder of 24-year-old Mary Lee McLean in her Mount Vernon Street apartment in Boston. None of those victims, including Jane Britton, are believed to have known or had any previous relationship with Mr. Sumpter. Sumpter had been convicted of committing a stranger rape of a woman in another Boston apartment in 1975. Mr. Sumpter died of cancer in 2001 at the age of 54, 13 months after he was paroled to hospice care from a 15 to 20-year sentence for that rape of the stranger in 1975. In 2002, following his death, Mr. Sumpter was identified by another CODIS hit in connection with an additional stranger rape in 1985, which was committed in Boston and was committed while Mr. Sumpter was on work release from a previous sentence. So to summarize, since his death, DNA testing in the CODIS database have identified Michael Sumpter in connection with 5 sexual assaults, 3 of which resulted in the death of the victims, Jane and the 2 women in Boston. In 2017, our office received several renewed requests for the Jane Britton file, asking that that be released to the public. Although we had continued to hold out hope that we might someday be able to make a DNA match to the partial profile that we had been able to obtain from swabs taken during the autopsy of Jane Britton in 1969. Without any new information or other leads to follow up at that point, a team of experienced investigators renewed their review of this file to prepare for the potential release of that file. During that review, in consultation with the lab, the decision was ultimately made to perform additional DNA testing with the most sophisticated testing then available on the remaining samples of evidence taken from the 1969 autopsy. In July of 2018, the crime laboratory notified investigators that there was a match to Michael Sumpter's CODIS sample then on file with the lab. As a result of receiving that information, investigators continued to pursue the locating of a male relative of Mr. Sumpter in order to obtain a DNA sample to complete the cycle of DNA testing. They were finally able to do that, and in September of 2018, we received notification that not only had other individuals, many of whom had been suspects for a number of years, had been excluded, but that Mr. Sumpter had been identified as the source. Crimes committed by strangers are some of the most challenging to solve. At the time in 1969 and for many years following that, there was no indication that Mr. Sumpter had any connection to Ms. Britton, to that building, or any of the events that had taken place. While we used the case file to direct our investigation, including continuing to interview many individuals who had been named as persons of interest or possible suspects, it is strictly thanks to the forensic development that we have been able to make the link between the 1969 murder of Jane Britton and Michael Sumpter. Over the years, we conducted multiple testing on that sample. At some point when it appeared that this would be our last attempt to conduct testing, the last effort to get a link, we consumed the last of that sample in conducting this testing. I'd like to recognize my Chief of Homicide, Adrian Lynch, who dedicated herself to this case and pursued all possible uses of forensic testing, and as well to Sergeant Pete Sennett of the State Police assigned to our office, who has been assigned to this case for over 20 years. Sergeant Sennett has literally traveled the globe in finding individuals, ruling people in and out, collecting the DNA samples that made possible this ultimate testing. The efforts of these individuals, as well as the work of so many other folks in this office who helped to bring us to this day, demonstrate, and it is my hope, make clear to other families who find themselves having lost someone to homicide with a case that is uncharged, that the Middlesex District Attorney's Office and the Massachusetts State Police never give up on a case, no matter what the passage of time may be. We are very grateful in particular to the members of the public and to the press who continue to pursue this case. We know that every unsolved homicide leaves families, friends, and loved ones without the individual who has been the victim of that homicide, but that burden is made particularly difficult when the family is also left without answers as to what happened. We know that that is often the most painful part. And it is my hope today, especially as we enter into Thanksgiving week, into the holiday season, that finally knowing who is responsible for Jane's brutal murder will provide some consolation to Jane's surviving family and friends. We'll take a few questions.